Guangzhou, the city known as the Southern Gate of China, is a bustling megalopolis, a colossal economic hub that attracts millions from all over. In 2016, an outlying district of this city, Panyu, was confronted with a horrifying truth, a case that not only shook the culinary industry, but also challenged the very limits of humanity. It all began with a human skull found in a pot of broth at a famous noodle shop. From that skull, a barbaric criminal network was unraveled, revealing the tragic fate of nearly 30 other victims. In 2016, on a dusty major road in Panyu, where heavy trucks roared day and night, there was a small, perpetually crowded eatery. Its faded plastic sign bore a few simple words: Old Wu's Ancestral Beef Noodle Shop. The owners were Mr. Wu Weimin and his wife, Li Shulian, a simple, honest-looking couple in their 40s. For years, their noodle shop had been a familiar stop for drivers and local workers. People came for the hearty, cheap bowls of noodles, and above all, for the broth, which had a rich, unparalleled sweetness. But about 2 months ago, a rumor began to spread among the regulars. The broth at Old Wu's seemed even more delicious than before. The sweetness had become unusually intense, captivating, and addictive. The beef balls were also chewier and more fragrant. People praised the Wu's for discovering a new secret, and their business flourished. No one, as they slurped down the last drop of broth, could have suspected that this exquisite flavor was bought with a horrifying secret, a crime against both the living and the dead. That secret might have remained buried forever, if not for the curiosity of a young delivery boy on one fateful afternoon. His name was Zhang Wei, 22 years old, a skinny young man with sun-darkened skin, typical of migrant workers. Zhang Wei had left his poor village in Hunan province for Guangzhou, hoping to earn money to send back to his parents. His job was delivering for a mobile app, riding his old electric scooter day in and day out through the scorching sun and sudden downpours of the south. Old Wu's noodle shop was one of the few luxuries he allowed himself. A bowl of beef ball noodles for 15 yuan, about $2, was enough to fill his stomach and give him strength for a grueling afternoon's work. That day was a sweltering weekend. After completing a nearby delivery, Zhang Wei stopped by the shop and ordered his usual bowl of beef ball noodles. He had to admit, the rumors were true. The noodles today were exceptionally delicious. He ate with gusto, savoring the rich sweetness that melted in his mouth. After finishing, he suddenly felt a slight discomfort in his stomach, perhaps due to the oppressive heat. He decided to use the shop's restroom. The restroom was at the back, accessible through a narrow, dark, and damp corridor that ran alongside the inner kitchen, a space that was always steamy and sweltering. As he walked past, Zhang Wei glanced into the kitchen through the slightly ajar door. He saw the gleaming stainless steel stockpot as large as a vat bubbling on the stove. At that moment, Mr. and Mrs. Wu were both busy at the front counter, collecting money and preparing noodles for a large group of new customers. The inner kitchen was temporarily empty. Suddenly, the broth in the pot boiled over violently. The lid was pushed up by the steam, rattling, and the broth began to spill out, sizzling on the brick stove. Zhang Wei was a helpful person by nature. Seeing this, and with no one around, he had the kind thought to sneak into the kitchen for a second, to lift the lid for them, to prevent the broth from boiling over completely. He quickly stepped into the scorching kitchen. Using a cloth, he grabbed the handle of the heavy stainless steel lid and tried to lift it just a little. And then, a sight met his eyes. A sight so horrifying, it made his blood run cold, and his breath catch in his throat. Inside the bubbling stockpot, amidst the hot steam, mixed in with spice bags and the green of scallions, was a strange object. It was pale white, roundish, and floating, bumping against the side of the pot with the rhythm of the boil. When a cloud of steam cleared for a moment, the object was revealed in stark detail. It had 2 deep, hollow eye sockets, a triangular nasal cavity, and a set of perfectly even teeth that seemed to be grinning at him. It was a human skull. A skull that had been simmered until the flesh was nearly gone, leaving only the stark white bone, being used as the main ingredient to create the sweetness of the noodle broth. Nausea rose in his throat. The rich, sweet taste of the beef ball noodles he had just finished suddenly became sickeningly cloying. He quickly put the lid back on, trying not to make a sound. His heart pounded as if it would leap out of his chest. He didn't dare to scream. Just then, he heard Mrs. Li's footsteps approaching. Panicked, Jiang Wei quickly backed away, slipped out of the kitchen, and walked straight towards the restroom as if nothing had happened. Inside, his mind was a blank. He locked the door and with trembling hands took out his phone. He hastily opened the camera app, trying to keep his hand steady, then went back out. He walked past the kitchen again, pretending to be on his way out. He raised his phone, panning it around as if taking a casual photo, but the lens was aimed at the stock pot, and he quickly snapped a picture. He didn't know if the photo had captured the horrific object, but he had to try. He hurried to the counter and paid Mrs. Li. She smiled at him as she always did. That smile, now in Jiang Wei's eyes, looked more terrifying than a demon's parry. He rushed out of the shop, jumped on his electric scooter, and sped away. He didn't continue with his deliveries. He went straight to the Panyu District Police Station. At the duty desk, still trembling, Jiang Wei reported the entire incident. Initially, the officers were skeptical of such a wild and gruesome story. But seeing the young man's terrified, distraught face and the blurry photo that was still clear enough to show an object resembling a human skull in the stockpot, they knew this was a real and extremely serious matter. The case was immediately reported to the Guangzhou Municipal Public Security Bureau. In less than an hour, a large force of criminal police, fully armed and equipped, was mobilized. Under the direct command of Captain Zhao Lidong, a famously tough investigator, the police convoy, sirens wailing, sped towards Old Wu's noodle shop. When the police stormed in, the shop was still full of customers. Mr. and Mrs. Wu, seeing the massive police presence, turned pale. Captain Zhao didn't waste words, heading straight for the inner kitchen with a team. He walked to the stockpot and, without hesitation, used an iron rod to flip off the lid. Before everyone's eyes, amidst the hot steam, a pale white human skull floated to the surface, clearly visible. Captain Zhao ordered the arrest of Wu Weimin and Li Xiulian. The terrified couple collapsed to the floor. Their charade was over. The news that police had found a human skull in the noodle broth at Old Wu's created a firestorm. The customers in the shop, upon learning the truth, couldn't contain themselves. They ran out into the street, vomiting violently. The entire area was plunged into horror and disgust. A case of unimaginable barbarity had officially begun. At the Guangzhou Municipal Public Security Bureau headquarters, Wu Weimin and Li Shulian were taken to separate interrogation rooms. Captain Zhao Lidong, along with a younger investigator named Wang Jie, began the questioning. They decided to interrogate the wife, Li Shulian, first. She seemed weaker and more psychologically vulnerable than her husband. Initially, Mrs. Li just cried, insisting she knew nothing and that someone had framed her family. But when Captain Zhao placed the photo Jiang Wei had taken on the table, along with clearer crime scene photos the forensics team had just sent over, Mrs. Li began to tremble uncontrollably. Officer Wang, who was more hot-tempered, slammed the table and shouted, asking how long she intended to keep up the act. The combination of the tough and soft approach from the two investigators quickly broke down Mrs. Li's defenses. She slumped over the table, sobbing, and began to confess. Her confession stunned both investigators. She admitted to using human bones to make the broth, but insisted that she and her husband were not murderers. She said the body had been supplied by someone else. When the investigators asked who that person was, Mrs. Li hesitated again. She only said it was a distant relative, then fell silent. Captain Zhao realized there was something more complicated behind this. He decided to pause the interrogation of Mrs. Li and move on to her husband. Wu Weimin proved to be much tougher than his wife. He just sat in silence, eyes fixed on the floor. No matter what the investigators asked, it took several hours, only after Captain Zhao informed him that his wife had partially confessed that Mr. Wu finally reacted. But his testimony took the investigation in a completely unexpected direction. He claimed that 2 months ago, a strange man had come to the shop. The man said he was from a triad and that they needed to dispose of a traitor in their organization. He offered the Wus a large sum of money to help them get rid of the body by cooking it in their stockpot. Drowning in debt, the couple had turned a blind eye and agreed. This testimony, though seemingly plausible, was full of contradictions. A triad would have hundreds of ways to dispose of a body, Why choose such a complicated and easily discoverable method? Captain Zhao suspected that Mr. Wu was fabricating the story to protect the real mastermind, possibly the relative Mrs. Li had alluded to. Just then, the forensics team sent a preliminary report based on the bone and tooth structure. The skull was identified as belonging to an Asian male, between 30 and 40 years old. More importantly, they found a very small fracture on the cranium, possibly caused by a blunt object. This suggested the victim might have been murdered, not died of natural causes. Based on Mr. Wu's testimony, Captain Zhao decided to temporarily pursue this line of investigation, partly to verify it, and partly to apply psychological pressure on the couple. He ordered Officer Wang and a team to review all missing person cases in Guangzhou over the past 3 months, especially those with ties to gang activities. A name quickly came into focus: Liu San, a notorious figure in Panyu involved in loan sharking and debt collection, who had mysteriously disappeared over a month ago. The investigation team began to focus on Liu San's rivals, summoning and interrogating dozens of high-profile gangsters. The investigation dragged on for a week. The investigators faced tough, cunning individuals who always had well-prepared alibis. They expended a great deal of effort, following leads in the city's underworld. But ultimately, this line of investigation hit a dead end when the forensics team returned with the final DNA results. They had taken a DNA sample from the skull and compared it with samples from Liu San's parents. The results did not match. The victim in the stockpot was not the missing gangster, Mr. Wu's testimony was a complete fabrication. This misguided line of investigation had completely collapsed. Captain Zhao was furious. He knew he had been led on a wild goose chase by the couple for the past week. He returned to the interrogation room, this time with a completely different demeanor. He placed the DNA results on the table, proving the victim was not Liu San. He told the WAS that the police's patience was limited and their stubbornness would only earn them a harsher sentence. Finally, faced with irrefutable truth and immense psychological pressure, Li Shulian completely broke down. She wailed, and this time, she spoke the name she had tried so hard to protect. The mastermind was not some triad. It was her own cousin, Li Jianjun, the director of the Yong'an funeral home. The confession of Wu Weimin and Li Shulian plunged the entire task force into a chilling silence. The truth was beyond imagination, beyond cruel. The case was no longer a single murder, but an organized crime, with a far more horrific criminal link hiding behind the gates of what was supposed to be a solemn place, the Yong'an funeral home. The investigation's focus immediately shifted to Li Jianjun, the funeral home director. Captain Zhao knew they were dealing with an intelligent, cunning individual with a certain social standing. Li was not a noodle shop owner on the brink of bankruptcy. He would not break easily. Any careless move would give him time to destroy evidence. A detailed and secret plan for a raid and comprehensive search of the Yong'an funeral home was drawn up. At dawn the next day, before the first cremations of the day had begun, a large force of criminal police, in coordination with SWAT units, suddenly stormed the Yong'an funeral home from multiple directions. Outwardly, it was a very modern and solemn facility. The grounds were landscaped and clean. The funeral parlor had a dignified architecture, and the waiting rooms for families were thoughtfully arranged. But the police didn't stop there. A main assault team, led by Captain Zhao himself, went straight to the office area and quickly subdued and arrested Li Jianjun while he was still half asleep. The young director, upon seeing the police, was stunned, but tried to maintain his composure, demanding to see a warrant. Meanwhile, other teams fanned out, securing all key areas: the cold storage room where bodies awaited cremation, the incinerator area, and especially the warehouse and records office. And it was here that evidence of a horrific criminal machine was gradually uncovered. In the office, while checking the books, investigators found the first irregularities. The records for the cremation of unclaimed bodies or those with waived fees had spiked dramatically in the past 2 months. But when cross-referenced with the incinerator's operating logs and fuel invoices, the amount of fuel consumed was far lower than what would be needed to cremate that many bodies. Clearly, a large number of bodies had been recorded as cremated on paper, but had never actually been put into the incinerator. In the cold storage area, the truth was even more horrifying. Alongside the bodies stored properly, awaiting cremation, there was a separate off-the-books cold storage unit. When opened, it contained 3 unshrouded bodies with no information whatsoever. This was Director Lee's stock waiting for shipment. But the most horrific discovery, the one that laid bare the entire inhumane nature of this criminal network, was in a small warehouse behind the incinerator area. In the warehouse, investigators found dozens of identical, cheap urns, pre-labeled with the names of deceased individuals who, according to the records, had been cremated in the past 2 months and were awaiting pickup by their families. Captain Zhao, sensing something was wrong, ordered one of the urns to be opened. Inside was not the fine grayish-white ash characteristic of human bone after high-temperature cremation. Instead, it was a coarse, dark gray powder, mixed with charcoal fragments and poorly ground animal bone fragments. They were fake ashes. At the same time, in another corner of the warehouse, they found the answer to the origin of the real ashes. Dozens of large sacks were piled up. When one was opened, it revealed simmered human bone fragments, stark white, emitting a nauseatingly strong fishy smell. These were the bones that the noodle shop owners, after using all the meat and fat, had returned to Director Lee. At this point, the entire process of the criminal machine became terrifyingly clear. It was a closed loop, a cycle of deception and utter depravity. 1. Director Lee received a body, especially an unclaimed one, or from a poor family. 2. He falsified the records to show it had been cremated. But in reality, he secretly sold the body to Old Wu's noodle shop. 3. The noodle shop used the human bones to make broth, and the meat was ground up and mixed with beef to make beef balls. After simmering, they returned the clean bones to Director Lee. 4. Director Lee used those bones, or animal bones and charcoal, to grind into fake ashes. 5. He put the fake ashes into an urn and gave it to the family of another recently deceased person who were lost in grief and had no reason to suspect anything. For 2 months, nearly 30 families had received the ashes of a complete stranger, or perhaps just charcoal and animal bones, to worship on their ancestral altars. Meanwhile, the bodies of their own loved ones had been turned into a commodity, an ingredient for a pot of noodle broth. Captain Zhao stood silently in the warehouse, looking at the neatly arranged urns of fake ashes on the shelves and the sacks full of human bones scattered on the floor. He had solved many murder cases, but never before had he faced a crime so cruel that it targeted the dead and trampled on the grief of the living. He knew the task force's work was only half done. They had caught the demons. But now, they faced the even more painful task of informing 30 families of this horrific truth and returning the correct names to each set of remains. The investigation had shifted from a criminal case to a social tragedy of immense scale. In the interrogation room, Li Jianjun, the director of the Yang'an funeral home, initially maintained an extremely calm and cooperative demeanor. He was completely different from the noodle shop couple. He was educated, articulate, and knew the law. He insisted he was a victim of slander, that the loss of a few unclaimed bodies was due to procedural errors by his subordinates. But when Captain Zhao laid out the irrefutable evidence collected from the funeral home, the fraudulent record books, the unusual fuel invoices, the photos of dozens of fake urns and sacks of processed human bones, the intellectual's mask was finally stripped away. Faced with the evidence, Director Lee knew any denial was futile. He didn't scream or panic. He just sat there, silent for a long time, then looked up, staring directly at the investigators, and he began to confess. His confession was not one of remorse, but a cold recounting of a failed business model. He talked about pouring all his savings and borrowing heavily to invest in the modern funeral home, but the profits were not as expected. In particular, the cost of cremating unclaimed bodies had become a financial burden. And then, after hearing his cousin and her husband complain about the fuel costs for their noodle shop, a sick business idea was born. He saw those bodies not as people, but as a type of inventory that needed to be disposed of in the most profitable way. He admitted to selling a total of 30 bodies over 2 months and taking back all the used bones to make fake ashes for the families of other victims. Director Lee's confession officially closed the criminal investigation. But it opened up a much more difficult and painful task for the task force. They had a list of 30 victims. They had 30 sets of remains that had been brutally desecrated. Now, they had to match them, to give back the right name to each person, and to deliver the horrific truth to 30 unsuspecting families. A large-scale DNA identification campaign was launched at the National Institute of Forensic Medicine. The best forensic experts worked day and night. They had to painstakingly extract DNA from bone fragments that had been thoroughly boiled in a stock pot, an extremely difficult task. In parallel, dozens of investigators were divided into 30 teams and began a tearful journey to each family on the list to collect DNA samples from relatives. Every meeting was an encounter with grief. The investigators faced tears, confusion, and even suspicion from the victims' relatives. They met an elderly mother, Mrs. Liu, who had lost her only son in a traffic accident. The old woman tremblingly gave the investigators a lock of her son's hair that she had kept as a memento. She didn't understand why the police needed it, but cooperated nonetheless. They met a young wife, Mrs. Wang, who had just lost her husband to a sudden stroke. She was raising 2 young children alone, and on the altar, the urn with her husband's ashes still had incense smoke curling from it. She cried and asked the investigators if there had been some mistake, that her family had already given her husband a proper funeral. Every story, every circumstance, made the hearts of the criminal officers feel as if they were being squeezed. They knew that in just a few days, they would have to return to these homes once again, to deliver a truth even more brutal than death itself. And then, the DNA results began to come back. Each set of remains was identified. The most painful work began. Captain Zhao and a female investigator went to Mrs. Wang's house. The house was still shrouded in an atmosphere of mourning. Captain Zhao said, his voice heavy, that he was very sorry to have to inform her of something. The DNA results showed that the urn the family was worshipping did not contain her husband's ashes. The young wife froze, then burst into tears, saying it couldn't be, that they were lying. "My husband is here," she cried. "I received his ashes myself." The female investigator gently took her hand, saying they understood her pain, but this was the truth. Her husband's body had been sold by the funeral home director, Li Jianjun, to a noodle shop as an ingredient, and they had found what was left of his remains. Hearing this, the young wife could bear it no longer. She let out a piercing scream and collapsed to the floor unconscious. This heartbreaking scene was repeated in 30 different homes. An elderly father, upon hearing the news, had a heart attack and had to be rushed to the hospital. A mother fainted. Children cried out in rage, demanding the death of those inhumane monsters. A wave of pain, outrage, and utter disgust swept through the community. They had already experienced the pain of losing a loved one once. Now, they had to experience it again, a second time, 100 times more painful and humiliating. They realized that all this time, the thing they had been reverently worshiping on their ancestral altars was the ashes of a stranger, or perhaps just animal bones. And the body of their beloved family member had been desecrated in a way they could never have imagined. The case was no longer a simple criminal investigation. It had become a scar, a collective trauma for an entire community. The city of Guangzhou and the entire country watched, waiting for the strictest sentence for the demons in human form. The case of the Yong'an Funeral Home and Old Wu's Noodle Shop sent a seismic shock across the nation. The scale and nature of the crime surpassed all imagination, making it one of the most barbaric and inhumane cases in criminal history. Public opinion boiled with rage, demanding the strictest sentence for the demons in human form. A few months later, the Guangzhou Municipal People's Court opened the first trial for the 3 defendants: Li Jianjun, Wu Weimin, and Li Xiulian. The trial attracted immense attention from dozens of media outlets and hundreds of citizens. Security around the courthouse was tightened to the maximum. Outside, relatives of the 30 victims' families stood, holding portraits of the deceased, their eyes filled with tears. They weren't there to cause trouble. They were there to wait for justice. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with indignation and sorrow. The 3 defendants stood in the dock. Li Jianjun, the funeral home director and mastermind of the entire crime, maintained a cold, emotionless expression. Beside him, The noodle shop owners, Wu Weimin and Li Xiulian, trembled, their faces ashen, not daring to look up at the people around them. The prosecution's indictment was read, lasting nearly an hour. Every detail, every criminal act of the defendants was reconstructed clearly and forcefully. The courtroom was plunged into a breathless silence. Many in the victims' family section couldn't hold back their sobs as they heard again how their loved ones' bodies had been so brutally desecrated. The questioning followed. Mr. and Mrs. Wu confessed to all their crimes, crying and begging for forgiveness. They blamed their circumstances, the desperation of their business that made them turn a blind eye. But their belated remorse could not soothe the pain of the victims' families. Director Li, on the other hand, answered the questions matter-of-factly. He admitted to the acts, but not to the guilt. He argued that he was merely conducting a business transaction, a solution to handle the inventory of unclaimed bodies. His arrogant, callous, and utterly inhumane attitude enraged the entire courtroom. The closing arguments were incredibly tense, but perhaps the most moving and haunting moment was when representatives of the victims' families were allowed to speak. Mrs. Wang, the young wife, stood up, her hand trembling as she held her husband's portrait. "My husband was a good man," she said through tears. "His death was already a great pain for my children and me. For the past 2 months, I have worshipped the urn of ashes that this monster gave me. I lit incense for it every day. I told it about our struggles. I prayed for its blessing. But it wasn't my husband. It was the ashes of cow bones, of pig bones, the ashes of other people. And my husband, his body, was taken by them and used as an ingredient to cook noodles." She asked, "This pain, this humiliation, how are we supposed to live with this?" Her words brought the entire courtroom to tears. After deliberation, the Judicial Council delivered its final verdict. The presiding judge, in a stern and indignant voice, declared that the defendants' actions were utterly barbaric and cruel, trampling on the most basic moral and human values of society. The defendants not only desecrated the bodies of the deceased, but also caused an irreparable pain and humiliation to 30 victims' families. Such acts had to be punished with the most severe sentence. The court sentenced the defendant Li Jianjun as the mastermind and instigator who abused his position and the sacred trust of the people to carry out a series of organized criminal acts, demonstrating ultimate moral depravity to the highest penalty, death. The two defendants, Wu Weimin and Li Xiulian, as active accomplices who directly desecrated 30 bodies for profit, were each sentenced to life imprisonment. The verdict was announced to applause and the sobbing cries of the victims' families. Justice had finally been served. The case was closed. Old Wu's noodle shop and the Yang'an funeral home were sealed and then demolished, becoming haunted places. The 30 victims' families, after receiving the correct remains of their loved ones, had to hold new funerals, once again bidding farewell to their family members in an unquenchable grief. This case shows us how terrifyingly thin the line between human and monster can be. From business desperation, greed, and inhumanity turned ordinary people into perpetrators of an unforgivable crime, a crime against both the living and the dead. It shows how depraved people can become when morality is completely overshadowed by money. The case will forever remain a scar, a horrific lesson about the degradation of humanity, and a reminder that respect for the dead is one of the last foundations of our humanity.